and welcome to Teme Valley Geological Society members and also to guests who are interested in the habitats and landscapes of Herefordshire. So this picture you can see there is from modern day Svalbard, and it reminds us of the days when ice reigned supreme in what became the temperate climates of today. The impact on today's world, its landscapes and habitats, is immense. Now we're going to explore this evening in the context of the relatively neglected field area of Western Herefordshire. And this has resulted from a lottery funded project which is continuing for the rest of this year. Now, we're living in a time of glaciers retreating, and in mountainous areas this has been very noticeable since the middle of the 19th century. Now here we are in Canada, and this is the Athabasca Glacier, and you can see a person standing up there on the top of that moraine, and
they're all old.
And that person standing on that moraine that was formed in the year 1860, and the glacier was up to that level at that time. And since then, it has wasted away and retreated. Incredible. In the lower left photograph, you can see something that looks like a milestone, and that actually indicates a year when the glacier was at that position. And every year they put up another milestone to show how the position of the ice front is retreating. So retreating glaciers are a feature of mountainous areas, and they have been for some time, and the retreat is accelerating at the moment. Here's another alpine glacier. This is another one I've worked on in Switzerland, the Sonneron Glacier, and you can see the glacier today in the distance. At the time, 1860, the glacier was where I was standing when I took this picture, and in the foreground there's a dump of sediment which is partly been colonized by grass now. So that's what we call the terminal moraine. This was the furthest extent of that ice back in 1860 at the peak of the Little Ice Age, and since then it's retreated back. So again, we can see the impact on this landscape that the glacier has had. There's a valley here that's been eroded. There's lots of sediment being deposited. There's a giant rock fall that's come from this face as that rock face has been exposed. There are deposits forming little lakes, as well as the streams around. So a whole new world opens up once glaciers get into a landscape. Now, from school, of course, people get taught about glaciation with a particular emphasis on upland landscapes. So upper left, we've got Ben Nevis, and I was very pleased to find it in that glorious blue sunshine this year, having never failed to, last year, having never failed to see it other than in cloud before. And Glencoe, the upper right. And some of you may know the lower left picture, which is in Herefordshire. So it's an upland area in Herefordshire. And because you're muted, you can't guess. But it's the Cat's Back, which is right on the edge of the Black Mountains in Herefordshire. So we're familiar with the ideas of these arêtes, these ridges, these combes, these excavated bowls and so on in upland areas. That's something that most people know about. But when it comes to lowland areas, it's actually rather more tricky. So if we look here in this upper picture, this is a part of the lovely county of Herefordshire, and this has been glaciated. The glacier was here some 20,000 years ago, and it's left very particular imprints on the landscape. But what they are is not possible to read very easily just looking at the picture. Even a very experienced geologist wouldn't be able to definitively say what it was in that view. But I can tell you there that this, in the upper picture, the middle ground, this dark ground with this flat skyline behind, that's a ridge, that's a morainal ridge that's been built up by deposits from a glacier, and since when the glacier retreated back further. And in the lower picture, I'm standing on that moraine ridge and I'm looking down into a lowland, and that lowland was impounded by, the water was impounded by that morainal ridge, and that became a lake in glacial times. So those are things that you can start to piece together once you have a lot of detailed maps and walk over the ground and dig into the sediment. But just looking at the landscape, a lot of things look similar, and it's difficult to work out what's going on. So the lowland landscapes are more subtle, but they're really fascinating once you start going around those landscapes and having a look at what you can do. And one of the things that we're doing in this project is to invent some landscape tours that you can take yourself on by bike or by car, and also walks that you can do to really get it into the landscape and feel it. Now, if we have a look at the ice ages and when they happened, in terms of Britain, then the most extensive ice age that happened in the last couple of million years was called the Anglian Ice Age. That was nearly 500,000 years ago. It's very prominent. Its effects are very prominent in East Anglia. So the whole of East Anglia was covered. We can see this red dashed line here showing us the southern limit of the Anglian ice. All of Worcestershire and all Herefordshire were covered by ice at that time. Now, because that was 500,000 years ago, the consequences of that ice age are not so easy to see in the landscapes now. There's very little of the glacial deposits still exposed. Most of them have been eroded away and so on. So there have been a lot of things happening since then. But the last ice age, which we call the Devensian, the effects of that ice age are much more prominent in the landscape. And if we look at the county of Herefordshire, that's shown here in yellow, the limit of that Devensian ice, the eastern limit, goes through the middle of the county. And so what we're going to be looking at is the western part of the county, which was affected by that younger Devensian ice age until about 20,000 years ago. And this is some reconstructions about the British-Irish ice sheet. At around 7,000 years ago, you see it was covering all the high ground, including Wales. But around 23,000 years ago, there was an advance. It's not clear from this map, but it did extend into Herefordshire at that time, as well as, surprisingly, going all the way down the Bristol Channel to the Scilly Islands, and then retreating back by about 18,000 years. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why it behaved like that, which I can't go into in the main part of the lecture, but I could answer if you have any questions afterwards. So this is a schematic view of the Herefordshire ice lobe. So there are areas of high ground to the north and south of this grey area, which is meant to represent the ice sheet. The ice is moving off the Welsh mountains down towards the east, and it gets about as far as Hereford. There's Hereford City shown there, that big circle. And then off the edge of the ice sheet, then we have meltwater streams that are draining it. So it was a very active system of rivers to the east of Hereford. So that's its maximum extent, about 23 or 24,000 years ago. It retreated back, and it actually paused a little bit around here. This is the moraine I showed you just now in the photograph, the Staunton moraine, impounding a lake behind it. So that was something that happened during the retreat. And we look and see where the maximum extent of the ice was, that red line here, in relation to the present day Lug Valley. We can see that the present day Lug Valley actually is quite close to the edge of the ice sheet, and so the consequences of those meltwater streams that came off the ice sheet are actually felt in the deposits in that valley, as I'll show you in a moment. So after the glacier retreated, almost certainly we were in a regime when there was permafrost present. So that's permanently frozen ground with just an active layer that melts each summer. So you have a kind of soggy top meter or so, and then ground frozen solid underneath that. And all sorts of interesting animals roaming around that tundra landscape. And then these big streams, these big braided streams covering over that area. So that's the kind of hinterland surrounding the ice sheets as they retreated back. And this is the cross section through the Lug Valley. So we're looking towards the north, and in the Lug Valley, you've got on the eastern side a series of terraces, a bit like the terraces that one gets in the Savon and Avon valleys, the higher ones being older, the lower ones being younger, and the rivers are successively cut down as the land has gradually uplifted over the last 500,000 years. And the material that's being brought out of the glacier, it's going from left to right, from west to east, this gravelly outwash from the glacier. In that gravel was found a mammoth tusk about in the mid-1980s, and that mammoth tusk has recently been restored by Kate Andrew, and it featured in the exhibition that was held last year in Hereford Museum. So that's proof that indeed, you know, these mammoths that we see in these pictures really are really were roaming around these landscapes. And so that event was rather later than these terraces that we see on the flanks of the lug on the other side of the valley. And then since this stage, we've just had the modern rivers developing, and they've got their own floodplains, and we've got the modern lug floodplain there. So that's what's going on outside of the maximum extent of the ice. And the rest of the talk will be focusing more on what's going on in the area that was actually covered by ice. And one of the characteristic features that we find in areas that have been covered by ice is that we have all kinds of interesting deposits formed. And when they form mounds, we call them moraines. And when they form a kind of chaotic mess of different mounds, they're called hummocky moraines. And hummocky moraines, as we see here, often have depressions in them, ponds there. And these will be kettlehole ponds. So some kettlehole ponds form very quickly, others take many thousands of years to form, basically formed by melting of ice that's underground. So it all depends on how quickly that ice melts. And as I say, the time that it takes to melt varies enormously. So ponds are a really distinctive feature of glaciated landscapes. And the project about which I'm speaking is called Conserving Herefordshire's Ice Age Ponds. So it's focused on the ponds, but in the context of the glacial landscapes, and it brings together an ecological and geological approach to these environments. So kettlehole ponds. Now, in general, we in the project we talk about ice age ponds, and ice age ponds are those which can be traced back, at least theoretically, to the Ice Age. They originated in the Ice Age, or the events were set in train during the Ice Age. Now, there are lots of depressions in an Ice Age landscape. Now, some of them might be channels that have been cut by meltwater. We'll see some of those during the course of the lecture. But the ponds are really distinctive because they're normally fairly round in outline. And to identify them, we look for certain things. So I've got here three pieces of evidence that could be available. And the first one is that they form a closed depression in the landscape. In other words, the water flows down into a closed depression, and that's where the pond is found. Now, closed depressions are actually not common in landscapes. The most common place you find them is in limestone landscapes, where water actually sinks underground anyway, and you don't get rivers. So this is the other situation where closed depressions can form, these kettlehole ponds. So if we find a closed depression, that's a good start. It may well be that we have a kettlehole pond. The other thing is that they should be surrounded by glacial sediments. They should be overlying a sediment that formed during the Ice Age and surrounded by glacial sediment. If you dig down immediately beneath the pond, of course, you can find sediment that was deposited after the Ice Age as well. So we allow for that as well. Now, normally that's all we've got to go on, but just occasionally there is some more evidence that's available. There's one pond that's been the subject of a geophysical survey, and we're hoping that a student project in the coming year will allow us to look at some more. The geophysical survey allowing you to penetrate underground and see what kind of sediments are there. And if you see a distinctly different pattern of sediment underneath a pond, that's a good indication that it was originally deeper and was originally a kettle hole pond. And in a few cases, coring has been done, recording the meters of sediment that has accumulated, filling in the pond. So this is how they form then in outline, that we have a glacier, and then this area of ice, there's no reason why it should be a different color blue from the rest of the glacier. It's just that it's ice that's not, in this particular case, is not moving. It's what we call dead ice. And then as the melting occurs around, here this dead ice is shown as being free of sediment, free of debris, such that by the time it melts, it actually forms a depression. And this is the kettle hole pond, and that kettle hole pond fills up with sediment. And peat is one of the most characteristic types of sediment, although you can get all kinds of silts and muds as well, of course. So there are a couple of ponds in Herefordshire that have dried out, and where augering through them has revealed a pollen dating back to about 14,000 years ago. So some of these ponds then have been shown to date back that far. That's a few thousand years after the Ice Age. Probably in the initial period after the Ice Age, either there hadn't been enough melting yet to form the ponds, or the original sediment infill didn't have very much carbon in it, and so couldn't be carbon dated. So the oldest carbon dates we've got are around this period of 13,500 to 15,000 years ago. So this is an example of one then. We're over here in Norton Cannon, and doing a bit of coring, and there's this lovely lush vegetation around the pond. They typically show changes in water level. Many of them dry out partly or completely as the summer progresses. And it's a bit pot luck when you try and core them as to what you get. If we're looking for a record of past environments, we're particularly interested in looking at peat, because peat contains pollen grains that can tell us about the vegetation of the past. But it's impossible to predict exactly what you'll find. And in this particular case, we've got a core at the bottom there. The top of it is to the left of the view. So we've got a dark grey peat resting on this pink clay in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, a grey peaty clay. So there's clearly been some changes in the water flow into that pond at different times in ways that is actually quite difficult to predict looking at the pond as we see it now. So that's an example of the relationship between the history of a pond, the sediment record, and the pond as we see it now. And we can express this in terms of an ultra simplified climate history, which you could get from the pollen analysis. So going from 14,000 years ago on the left to 11,000 years ago on the right, what we find in Herefordshire, and this mirrors what is found in the country as a whole, is a change in the types of pollen. So there was a period between 13 and 14,000 years ago, illustrated by this birch pollen here, when there was a birch juniper woodland in the area. Then things warmed up. Sorry. Then things got colder, and all the trees were replaced by cold-loving grasses and sedges. So there's a body from a sedge there. And then things warmed up again after 1,500 years, and we see warm-loving tree species, including oak, hazel, and elm. And this is a piece of oak. This is an individual pollen grain of oak. And that cold period is known as the Younger Dryas cold period. It was the last time that there were glaciers in Britain, and there were glaciers in the Scottish Highlands and in some parts of Wales at that time. And in Herefordshire, it just got the changing conditions is shown by the change in vegetation. Now, the project itself then. So we've got 3 local organisations which have worked together, and actually for several years working together to plan the project, and then apply again when it was turned down, and again. And in the end, quite a substantial amount of money has been obtained by the National Lottery Heritage Fund to work on various aspects of conserving these ice age ponds and to understand the context, the glacial landscapes in which they're found. So the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust is at the core of this and doing the administrative stuff, as well as housing the project manager. The Herefordshire Amphibian and Reptile team were very important in conceiving the project and supporting the project. And two members of that team have also been contracted as ecological consultants to work on monitoring the ponds, their biotas, and recommending how the ponds should be better managed. We've got a LiDAR image. I'll show you a bit more about LiDAR in a moment, showing you a landscape which is pocked with depressions in which there are ponds, as well as hummocks in between. And then we got some characteristic sort of iconic life forms here, great crested newt, the medicinal leech, and a rare beetle called Graphoderus, which is quite distinctive. So you don't see these things often, but they are quite distinctive. And one of the things that we're trying to tease out is there a sense in which these ponds are different from ponds that don't date back to the Ice Age? It's quite a tough one actually to work out, because there may be one or two species that indeed there are one or two species that are present here, and also in somewhere quite a long way away, like Herefordshire, suggesting they might originally have been connected. But it's a pretty difficult thing to establish for sure. But there are other more general things that help to make these ponds special, as I'll show you. Well, here's some of the team there. So we've got Richard, Giles and Will, whose main home is the Herefordshire Amphibian Reptile team. Andrew on the right there, who works for the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, and David Hutton is the project manager working for the project and based at the Wildlife Trust. And then Beth Andrews, who a number of you at the Teme Valley Geological Society know, has been worked on the Building Stones project that Earth Heritage Trust ran, and has been the Earth Heritage Trust project officer in this project. And so she's been particularly involved with volunteers, going out with volunteers and making sure that the work is done well. And there's actually adapted things very well during the COVID crisis by devising different ways in which surveys can be done, looking more at the extent to which ponds have appeared and disappeared over the last 150 years, using old maps, by having surveys with just one or two people going in the field. And we hope later in the year there will be more opportunities for larger groups to go out and for us to resume our intensive surveys. And Beth would very much like to hear from you, and you can contact her via the Earth Heritage Trust email address, via our website or by this email. Now then, let's have a look at a bit more at what some of these things look like. So at the top here, we've got a hummocky moraine landscape. You can see this very nice undulating land, and then there's a patch of woodland here, and there's a pond hidden in there. And that pond, we cored it. It's got many meters of peat underneath it. It's now substantially covered with woodland. In the middle picture, we see one of the several distinctive ponds in Kenchester. Particularly distinctive because it changes in water level considerably at different times of the year. And then the bottom one is the one you've already seen at Norton Cannon with volunteers at work. Now, I was delighted to find this particular pond here. This is at the village of Lucton, which is northwest of Leominster. And I was looking for a pond that was along the route of a trail by bike or car. And it was a bit frustrating because actually to find ponds that people could actually go and see, most of the ponds are on private land. And so to have one that's on a public right of way, and which is also a really nice example of a pond, was a real bonus. So this one at Lucton, it's based on a kind of boulder clay sediment, and you can see here it's been, some of this material has been dug out of the pond, and you can see on the right hand side you can see pebbles in a kind of clay matrix. So that there has been some excavation going on relatively recently in the pond, but for ecologically though, it's actually in a good state because it doesn't have very much vegetation around the margins. And that's good because if there's too much shade, that reduces the diversity of invertebrates. There's some trees around this side, but I mean, that's fine. Mostly it's pretty open. There is some stock. So there is, there's a question of stock chomping at the edge of the pond, but actually there are quite a few interesting plants in the water adjacent to the margin. So it's in pretty good condition. And Giles was with me on that day, and Giles got active with the net, and it's just wonderful to see, how rich and diverse the fauna is in this pond. So we've got different species of pondweed, an invasive species, but not an aggressively invasive species, the Canadian pondweed. Hornwort, a local, a native plant. And then all these amazing snails, these great pond snails. That was quite a revelation to see how many there are. And I think that's it's not the case in all ponds. And here we've got things like a leech. That's not the medicinal leech; it's another type of leech, and all kinds of bivalves, of freshwater beetles, a larva, a newt larva, and then all kinds of beetles, and of course all of them moving around quite frantically once they've been netted. So a whole new world opens up once you start netting these things. So life is teeming there. They're very important parts of our local ecosystem, important habitats. Now, but of course, this is a talk to the Teme Valley Geological Society, so I'm going to concentrate a bit more on geological things for the rest of the talk. This map just shows us the area geographically, with Hereford and Leinster on the east, Kington the northwest, and these stippled areas are the areas where we get ponds and hummocky moraines. So there's quite a big area actually. It's dozens of square kilometres where these things occur. So it's actually really quite difficult to get your head around. So even with a substantial resource in the lottery, it's very hard work just to get around and understand what's there. Many of these places in the areas are just small villages, and it's pretty quiet. Away from the main roads, it's a very, very quiet, unspoiled part of the world, and the landscapes are they're low key, but they're really interesting. And so as I worked out a route on my bike to do a landscape trail, it was really interesting, just sort of discovering and understanding how the landscape fits together. So that, as we'll see, the trail starts in Herefordshire, goes out through past Kenchester up to this area of Norton Cullen here, up to past the beautiful village of Almley, where we've got a walk as part of the tour there, if you want to do that, up to just east of Kington, and then across up to the Arrow Valley, and then east, and then really nearly up to the see, Luckton's right up here. We're right up the northern margin of where the glacier was, and then up to Luckton and over to Alton in the northeast. So it's a great sweep of countryside, and a beautiful countryside that the tour goes through. So that's going to be implemented as an app. It'll be on the website as well by the time it's finished. So that will be in a few months' time. Now, I'm going to show you some LiDAR images, and LiDAR is this amazing way of very accurately topographically surveying the ground. And of course, LiDAR is used for all sorts of things. It's used to stop you bumping into an adjoining car if you're driving. It's just an amazing variety of uses for it. But from an aeroplane, you can send a laser signal, hit the ground, time how long it takes to come back. That gives you the height of the ground with an accuracy of about 1 centimetre. So we now have these amazingly detailed topographic maps. So we've gone from a pretty rough and ready contour maps, these 5-meter contours that the Ordnance Survey produced, they're actually not very accurate when you look at them in detail. And but now nearly the whole country is covered with LiDAR. They're meant to be filling in the gaps over this last year. So we're nearly there in terms of a really good coverage everywhere. So the left-hand view here is an example of a LiDAR image where that raw data in terms of heights of the land has been converted into what it would look like if the sun was shining across it and there was no vegetation. So it's showing you all the pimples, as you can see in the landscape. So this is a landscape of hummocky moraines, but it's really quite weird. As a typical glacial geologist coming here would expect to see these hummocks in lines, showing you the way the ice advanced and retreated, but they don't do that very well, and we're still not really sure why that is. And we're hoping to get people more involved from Keele University in trying to solve this riddle. But an amazing looking landscape. And I put in blue here the ponds that are marked on Ordnance Survey maps, so you can see that there are still a lot of existing ponds here, and undoubtedly a lot of others that have dried up over the millennia. And we can compare this way. Let's say this is a modern glacier in Austria, where there's some rains, and there's some ponds that are formed quite quickly after the glacier has retreated. Now then, here's some volunteers. Now, somebody mentioned before we started this evening that they'd been to the lawn pool in the Moccas estate, and I said, oh, I must apologise, I'm not going to mention that, but in fact I'd forgotten that I got this slide. This is another group of volunteers who from Leinster U3A, and we took out, and we got absolutely drenched by this torrential rain, but it only lasted half an hour, then the sun came out. It's a great thing about field work. So in our surveys then, what we've done is we've used historical maps like the one on the left, used modern maps and compared them to see how things have changed over that time. And then we can get very detailed contours. So here I've drawn in some contours at 1 meter intervals that I've got from LiDAR. And for very detailed pond surveys, I've actually drawn up 10 centimeter contours, amazingly detailed contours that you can use to predict how each of these ponds will expand and contract as the water level rises and falls. And we can compare this with an aerial photograph here. So in the pond surveys then, that the habitats are investigated, the whole site is described, it's all good. And we've also done some measurements of water quality. I'm really interested in the hydrology of these ponds. I was hoping that we might get 1 or 2 student projects to work on the hydrology, but it doesn't look as though that's going to happen now. But what we don't know basic things like, is the water that we see in the pond linked to the groundwater? Is it sinking into the ground and then coming out from the ground at certain times of the year, or is it disconnected? I mean, the lower diagram shows us a perched water table. So some ponds may be perched way above the aquifer that's found regionally. And generally, we just don't know. There isn't enough information on them. And so far, we've only been able to do a detailed pond survey once, so we haven't really been able to pick up on the seasonal changes yet. These are a couple of maps that have been produced. This is a map that's been produced by LiDAR and by a colleague at the University of Worcester. And this is showing us the catchments. These are these little closed catchments where the water drains inwards, so that these wiggly lines have been drawn from the height data from the LiDAR. So there's a whole series you can see here of these closed catchments, many of which have got ponds that are shown on Ordnance Survey maps, which are the light blue. The mid blue are ones that have been picked up from satellite images, and the dark blue are ones that have been actually surveyed by volunteers. And that's the same area in an aerial photograph, and it looks completely different because in this image you can't see the field boundaries, because the field boundaries are actually independent of the detailed topography that we looked at. This is a very subtle topography in this particular case. So interesting, I say subtle landscapes or interesting landscapes. So one of the remits of the project is to engage, well, engage all the stakeholders, and then of course that includes the landowners, and to actually try and open landowners' eyes where they don't already know to the special nature of these places and best way of looking after them. So issues like pollution, for example. I mean, our measurements of phosphate in the water show that there's quite a variation in phosphate. There's some, and the average is, like lowland areas generally, too high. But with a pond, you've got more chance of actually making a difference to that situation by controlling very local sources of pollution. So there are various suggestions here. This leaflet's gone out to landowners. We've had some landowner events, and of course, when permission is obtained to go and visit ponds, that contact is made. And many landowners actually have been really very interested and supportive in this work. Now then, this is just show you where some of these trails are that were produced during the project. So the furthest extent of the ice is shown by this dotted dark blue line that goes here from Hereford up to Leinster. That's the eastern ice limit. And then the long trail that I showed you, what I call the landscape tour, I said goes from Hereford out to the west and then up to just east of Kington and then over to the north of Leinster up to Alton. So that's quite a long thing, and it's broken up into 3 sections. But there are also lots of shorter routes here that are shown in different colours, and these are walking trails where you can get up, get up close to look at ponds and other features of the landscapes. And they're being developed in, as I say, in an app as well as a website. So the walks around wildlife reserves, there are 2 of those that we've got. One of them is at the Birches Farm Reserve, which is shown here in green near the western side of the map. And then further south, the Sturts Reserve in the Letton Lowlands down here. And the great thing is we've been able to establish those routes on reserves of the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, so that they're open access all the time. And we've also had drone footage by Ian Maddock of Worcester University, which is going to be incorporated into the apps. The car tour, that's the one that's, oh sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, the long tour has along its length some walk, so that if people are doing a long tour, they can also do a walk along the parkway. One of them is at Brighton, and I'll show you some details of the Brighton one in a moment. Rockhall Walk, it's a former quarry, now it's a nature reserve. And then the beautiful village of Almley, which has got this amazing dingle nearby, which was cut by ice, and that's another walk. So for the car tour, then there are 3 sections. It's too much to take in all in one day, even if you could drive it all. So there's lots to see. And then if you're a cyclist, then cyclists would like to do their different days as round trips. So we've shown them as we've developed them as round trips. So the idea is you start somewhere like day 2, you'd start at Webley, you'd go and join the trail, go around the trail, and then go back to Webley at the end. So and the same up here with Kingsland being a starting point. So that's what we've got in progress. Now, what I'm going to do is to show you some examples of these glaciated landscapes. I'm starting first. Let's go back to here. So Hereford's down here in the lower right. The Brighton Walk's down there. I'll show you a bit about that. I'll show you Kenchester, which is around this area here. Then we'll go across to the Staunton Moraine a bit further west. Then we'll go up north. We'll go and look at Lions Hall Country Park. It's up here on the Arrow Valley. Then we'll go east along the Arrow Valley, and then we'll go to east along the Arrow Valley. Then we'll go up to the northern limit of the main ice flow. We'll visit the Shogden area and Lupton, and finish at Alton. So we'll look at a whole series of sites along that kind of loop there. Now, firstly, starting at Brighton. So Brighton is just a few miles west of Hereford. and you can see the River Wye looping around here. Now, something rather weird happens when it approaches Brighton. It starts to cut into the landscape, and there's actually these are all called gorges. Now, of course, if you come from Bristol, you'd say that's not a gorge. The Avon Gorge is a gorge, but they are actually, in relation to what we see elsewhere, they're really quite deeply cut into the landscape, and that cutting happened very, very quickly as well. So there's a cliff along here near the village of Brighton Common, which I'll show you in a moment. So there's a great significance to this. These gorges developed because of diversion of water, because of the Ice Age. That's why they're there, and I'll explain a little bit about that. So before the Ice Age then, there was a river that we called the Proto-Wye that flowed to Hereford, and this black arrow shows you where it went. So it's quite a long way further north than the present course of the Wye. So let's look next at this strange valley here. You can see this valley that goes through near to places B7, B8. That valley is, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. That valley is a dry valley. So what's it doing there? Why do we have a dry valley in the middle of this landscape? Well, the answer is that it was a valley that was cut by meltwater that was actually underneath the ice when the water was flowing. And we know it must have been underneath the ice because the water actually flows uphill here, over to the crest of the hill, and then down again the other side. That's a characteristic feature of meltwater that's under pressure underneath the ice. So at a time when the ice covered the whole area, then all sorts of interesting stuff was going on here, and big channels were being cut. So this was 23,000 years ago. Then the ice starts retreating, and let's just tell you a bit about these meltwater channels then. So this is a place, so I took this picture on Svalbard, walking across this glacier. Now this is a bit spooky actually. It's a small stream, but if you step in it, your legs would fall from under you, and you would be swept away by that stream, and you'd arrive at some great moulin and descend to the bottom of the glacier where you would be crushed. It would be frightening. So superglacial streams can be a bit tricky. You've got to jump over them. And the water disappears down to the bottom of the glacier. And when it gets to the bottom of the glacier, it can amalgamate together several of these streams and excavate great big tunnels. And during the peak meltwater period, huge amounts of sediment are being transported by these meltwater streams, and they can erode quite deeply into the landscape. So that's a meltwater channel. We can see the results of this cutting in the landscape, as I mentioned just now. We'll see some more examples, but there's that meltwater channel just sort of sitting in there. So then the ice retreats, and as it retreats back, the problem now is that sediment has been deposited here in the north, which is where the river used to flow before the Ice Age. So because there's an unusually thick amount of sediment just here, filling in that former valley, the River Wye that starts to form again can't go that way. So instead it diverts around and it cuts a new channel somewhere that's a bit easier to cut through, which turns out to be the current course. So this cutting down here probably happened within just a few thousand years at the end of the Ice Age. And so if you go to the river that's very fast and swift flowing, and you look behind you there and you're looking up to the top, there's a house on top of the cliff up there. It's very steep. In fact, the riverside path has collapsed in several places, and the public right-of-way doesn't exist anymore because it's so steep in that place. So it's a 30-meter high cliff. So that's quite a really interesting place to discover. But it's quite a spectacular place in a low-key way, and it's all sitting there in the landscape. And this is typical of the secrets that we can uncover in Herefordshire. Now, going a little bit further west to Kenchester. Kenchester is the site of a Roman town, so it's quite important archaeologically. But there's actually no information available if you go there as to any of that. That's kind of kept under wraps. But what we can see in terms of the landscape is hummocky landscape with these depressions that are mostly filled with ponds, and the ponds, some of the ponds are really got some very diverse ecosystems and are really nice, and the landscapes look nice in this area as well. It's a very nice gentle landscape. The green colour is the hummocky moraine. The red is the pink colour is the river outwash deposits, and the blue is a kind of just a flatter landscape with a boulder clay, a till formed underneath the ice, and the yellow are stream deposits that formed after the ice age. So the Kenchester area then is really characterised by these hummocky moraines, and in places there are some peat deposits shown here in this darker yellow colour that are underneath the ponds. So here's what one of those ponds, I think I showed you this one earlier on with a big tree in it, and this is one that varies in its water depth enormously from different times of the year. It is fed by a spring, which is shown here, and the water levels are higher now than they were a few years ago, and maybe this is something to do with the Yaser Brook flood alleviation scheme, which led to quite a lot of water being diverted into the Wye, and a lot of water being pumped out of the aquifer and moved around. So some recent changes there. Now we're going a little bit further west, and we're reaching this area here where the Staunton Moraine is. I showed you this picture earlier on, and this is lovely view. This is at the end of the first day of the cycle tour or the motor tour, looking down into this amazing lowland landscape. It's almost completely flat down there, and that's because it was a lake bed during the Ice Age, and because it's so flat and because it's quite close to the River Wye, it actually floods very easily when there's a high rainfall. So we'll see a picture of that in a moment. So that last picture was taken from viewpoint 14, looking down into this basin here. And this is where it was. There was a river building out to it from the north at the time. And one of the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust reserves is the Sturts Reserve, and it's shown here in red. So that's a walking route that you'll be able to do hopefully next summer. That'll be advertised, and you can walk around that area, walk around some of the ponds and look at that landscape. So it's very flat. It's a former lake bed, but there are lots of ponds there, and the question is, why are they there? Maybe there were icebergs floating into the lake that melted. They don't seem to be man-made. They do appear to be genuine. So it is very, very different from some of the other areas. This is Norton Callan up here by number 15. You can see lots of little depressions here, some of which are filled with peat. But again, the landscape's pretty flat here, not as flat as it is down over here at the Sturts, but again, pretty flat. So that's again something that would be nice to know more about. Our friends from Keele University can help us. Now, this area I said floods. Well, this is it last February. What an amazing picture that is. That was featured in the local newspaper. It's pretty close to the Wye floodplain. There's the Staunton Moraine over there. Now, the Wye used to go to the left of Oakers Hill, and it's now going in a completely different direction. So we'll have a look at the map of that in a minute. But before I do that, this is the moraine. Now, when we originally saw the moraine, we thought it was a kind of ridge, and the tendency is to think, oh, that moraine it's really thick. There's a couple of 100 feet of deposit there, but in fact, it turns out that most of the hill is actually the bedrock, and we've got a drape of sediment over the top. That's what happens in most parts of the Staunton Moraine. So it's not quite as it seems. And so a lot of these landscapes, you've got to be really very careful in interpreting them as to the extent to which an upland area is actually a moraine that's just loose sediment, or whether it's actually on top of bedrock. Now, there's another twist to this story, though. This is not the whole story, and that comes down to what happens here at point S. Now, you saw a picture where you saw the Oakers Hill, and the Wye used to go along here, along this dashed pale blue line through there, and it used to go through the place that's called S and down like that. And now it doesn't. You can see here that it runs near the southwestern end of this picture, around there. And again, you can see it's incised into the landscape. There are cliffs here along here. So there's been another river capture event. And the Staunton moraine, you can just about make it out. It's quite a subtle feature, but it's running along here and then around here through Point S. So Point S is on the Staunton moraine, and yet this is where the river used to flow. And the reason that that claim is made is because the BGS have put a borehole down here, and they found that there is 50 meters of glacial sediments here before they reach bedrock. So whereas in most of the Staunton moraine, you see there's only about 10 meters of glacial deposit, here there's 50 meters. So this was actually a depressed area before the Ice Age, and it got filled up with this huge plug of sediment, so that when the ice retreated, the river couldn't flow this way anymore, and so it had to divert and form a new course. So that's yeah, so that story, I think it's a really exciting story, but there's nowhere you can actually find that story very clearly. It's just written in between the lines, really, in the BGS memoir for the area. But it's quite an exciting story of change in the Wye. Now we're going further north. We're going up east of Kington and going to Linesall Park Wood. And this is a really another amazing, beautiful, beautiful place with a lovely big, it's actually an artificial pond called the Tramway Pool in the middle of this forest here. But you can wander around there. So it's a private woodland, but it is open access. And there are some bridle ways through it as well. So anyone following the cycle route can actually take a bridle way through the forest. So it's a lovely place to go, whether by car or by bike. And then the other thing is it's got this quite extraordinary story, apparently, which again hasn't really been written up. It's mentioned in someone's thesis from 30 years ago, but it's not really widely known. And the view we just had a look at there was from Point 20, and sort of looking north across this valley. And the River Arrow, as you can see, is on the left-hand side of this 3D LiDAR image, and then it diverts around to the north. It does something a bit weird. It looks as though it ought to continue towards the east along here. And almost certainly it probably used to do that. And for some reason, it got diverted and formed another gorge through here. And there's actually still a little bit of a preserved railway line that runs along there, which is quite an exciting thing to discover. But so this valley through here then is maybe a former valley, and it's now been choked up. So exactly how that happened or when it happened, we don't know, because there's been no subsurface survey of this area. But it's clearly an important part of that, and almost certainly the River Arrow was diverted at some stage. If you go straight east from here, you come to Pembridge, and so it may be that was where the old course and the new course joined together again. So in this area there are hummocks, but they're quite variable in morphology. Some of them are quite elongated, some of them are more patchy and small and rounded. Again, quite difficult to understand why the hummocky terrain varies so much. Now we're going further east again. We're by the side of the River Arrow, and again we've got some nice sort of hummocky landscapes, but we've also got some depressions. And look at this long depression here, and this long depression is now filled with something that's a bit like the Everglades swamp, with very, very dense vegetation underlain by peat. And this must have started out as a subglacial drainage channel because of its shape. It's clearly not a kettle hole pond. It's much too elongated. So we see quite a lot of these hummocky moraines in this part of the world, on the Arrow Valley, and also quite a few different ponds in different parts along the route. And there's a pond at B, which I'll show you at the next slide. And this is at the end of a large arable field with hummocky topography, and then just sitting there in the corner of that field is this rather nice pond, which we haven't yet surveyed in detail, but it'd be nice to do so. And now we're going further east again. We're now, oh no, we're going north now. So we were nearly at Staunton in Arrow just now, and we're now going through Staunton in Arrow, and we're going north, and we're nearly at the B road, which joins Shobden to Pristine, and that sort of runs along here. Now, there's a line of hills along there, and that line of hills limited the extent of the glacier. So the glacier had a northern boundary to it, which is shown by this yellow line. And south of that line, you see we've got this hummocky topography. North of the line, the landscape is much more smooth. So this is the part, this southern part here is the part that was affected by the glacial erosion and deposition, and the ice was moving from west to east here. But there's another interesting story in this part of the world, and it's a story of another river migration, another river capture event, because it's thought that the River Lug used to flow through here into this terrain, and it was diverted. And we don't know when it was diverted. It may have been a previous ice age, but now that River Lug goes through a gorge here, the Kinsham Gorge. You see how sharply defined it is. Now that must be the effect of our diversion, and it was thought, you know, it went through here, and then something blocked it. Probably it was ice that blocked it, and there may have been a lake here, perhaps. But again, there's no investigation of it. We're now up in the British Geological Survey sheet that was never published, the Knighton sheet. We're now in that area, so it's an area that hasn't been investigated in detail. Certainly, the Quaternary deposits haven't been. So this is an interesting story that seems as though it happened, but there's no detail, and we don't know exactly when it happened. And there's a nice viewpoint across here from point V, and we'll show you that in the next slide, which is here. We're looking across. This is the what may have been the floor of a lake at one point. The gorge that goes through Kinsham is over here, and then the original River Lug would have flowed through the Byton Gap here on the right-hand side. And then going a little bit further east again, we're now coming to the Shobden area. There's some lovely large moraines here. Now, in previous Earth Heritage Trust literature, these were said to be streamlined and elongated, but actually when you look at them on the LiDAR, they're not actually elongated here. They're actually round, even though they look as though they are on this particular photograph. In fact, the ones I've just shown you are these ones down here. There's 4 of them, but they're not actually particularly elongated, but they are very distinctive and they look smooth. So in the Shobden area, one of the things that's really distinctive is to have these really deep meltwater channels that are cutting through, eroding through. So there's some really quite nice, very narrow, deep valleys in this area that are related to meltwater, in addition to this hummocky terrain and some ponds. And then going further east again, we come to Lucton, where I showed you the invertebrates from that pond at Lucton earlier in the talk. We've got some really large hummocky moraines, and these actually are streamlined, but they're really big. I mean, this one here is about 400 meters long, and we know that in some of these hills around here are actually bedrock hills. You see this grey area here, that's a bedrock, and there's another one. So it might be that the shapes we're seeing here are actually not directly, but they might predated the Ice Age, or they might represent glacial erosion rather than streamlining of the glacial deposits themselves. So there's a story there that needs to be teased out. But again, some very distinctive landscapes. And then right at the far northeastern end of the landscape tour, we come to the Alton Moraine. And I thought this was a great place to end this tour because you have to climb up a big hill at the end. It's called Bircher Knoll. This is the view from the hill, fantastic view across to Clee Hill. And the moraine itself kind of meanders around. You can see that the view is from this point 40 here, but the moraine meanders around here, across the valley, across the Lug Valley, and around like that. And this was an ice limit, and it actually dammed river flow. as we'll see in a moment. So it actually is quite an important paleogeographic feature affecting drainage. So up here on the top of this hill, we've got some boulder clay. It's a glacial deposit, but the bedrock isn't far away underneath. So again, this is probably a thin glacial deposit draping over that landscape. And there's a very enthusiastic farmer down here who wants to do some pond preservation work. So we're hoping that, they'll be working on their pond down there and improving that.
Mm.
Now then, this is kind of summing up some of these amazing changes in the landscape, and I'm very grateful for Dick Bryant helping me with working all this out, because I'd known that there were these various glacial lakes and overflows, and there were changes in river courses, but I just couldn't get my head around it all until we finally put this map together to work it out what happened. Now, earlier in the talk, I told you about the Lions Hall Park Wood, that there was this channel, this east-west channel, and then there was the gorge of the Arrow just further north. So probably, so the question is whether where the east-west channel is, was that an earlier course of the River Arrow? If so, it would have come across to Pembridge over here. So that's a possible diversion. There's certainly a gorge here suggesting a diversion. Then there was the glacier, the Byton area, where the Byton Gap. So this looks to be a former course of the River Lug. There's another one here. This is in the Covenhope Valley, which I didn't show you a picture of. It's quite near Mortimer Cross, which is here, and that's another one. And then so there's another gorge at Sned Wood through there. So there's several of these, and then we've got some quite famous stories up here. So the Downton Gorge is of course a very famous gorge through which the River Teme runs, and of course, as we are the Teme Valley Geological Society, we have to conclude by talking about the Teme. So the Teme goes through Downton Gorge now. It didn't used to do that, and it did it because this glacial lake formed in here that was dammed by ice, and it cut the Downton Gorge and allowing the River Teme to carry on further east. Now, the river, the complication here is that river used to flow south to Leominster and down to Hereford. But at some point there was a blockage here, and this is probably related to that Alton moraine I showed you just now. And we have this lake called Lake Wufferton forming, which overflowed, and it overflowed to the east of Tenbury Wells, because we know that the Teme didn't always flow west to east in this part of the world. There used to be some small streams that flowed towards the west, and then later the Teme was deepened and the flow was established through here to the east and onto the Severn, and so that happened at some point in the last ice age. So we see we've had all kinds of very interesting changes to the drainage, and they generally are connected with the way that glaciers have dammed up lakes and so on in the landscape. So this is my final slide, just to remind you of the diversity of things that we've seen in Herefordshire. The landscapes are quite subtle compared with the mountainous landscapes that you're more familiar with in the context of glaciation. But the range of habitats created by the ice age is enormous, and the interest is certainly there. And I hope that by using some of the tools that we're producing during the project, that you'll be able to explore them as well. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you. Very, very nice. I don't think we can organise applause at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
You're all on mute. Unmute.
Mute, everybody.
All on mute. We'll give you applause.
Bravo.
Ian, they were great. Ian, thank you very much for a really detailed and fascinating exploration of Western Herefordshire and what went on there. An early question for it kept sort of ticking in my mind, partly because I've been to Finland, is uplift, which often is variable, not sort of across a whole landscape. And I wondered whether you felt that had a role to play as well. Hello, Ian.
So we would, Well, the longer the time that we've got available, the more that you can detect uplift effects.